It began with a sound I could not name, a low resonance that quivered somewhere between the rafters and my chest. The organ had been tuned that morning, the choirmaster said, though to me it felt less like tuning and more like the awakening of something old. I was standing near the rear pew, rain still clinging to my coat, when the first note of evensong drifted into the nave. It was then that I saw her as one of the altos, middle-aged, deliberate, the kind of face that carries silence like a calling. She sang with her eyes half closed, as though the hymn were less prayer than memory. Afterward, the verger found me lingering by the brass memorials. He asked, gently enough, if I was there for the service or for the incident. The word hung awkwardly in the air like a cough not meant for a chapel. I told him I was there for both. He looked relieved, or perhaps absolved, and led me down a narrow passage that smelled of candle soot and polish. The choir stalls above still trembled faintly with the echo of the hymn. They had found the young tenor that morning, folded into the shadowed corner behind the organ screen. No marks of violence, no sign of struggle. His hands were clasped neatly, as though placed there by someone who wished to preserve the illusion of peace. But peace, in my experience, is the first thing a lie destroys. The choirmaster's voice, when he spoke of it, kept slipping between outrage and guilt. He said the boy had been gifted. He said the hymn had been his favorite. He said too much, and I listened to the spaces between. Outside, the rain had hardened into sleet. I lit a cigarette beneath the cloister arch, thinking of how sound carries differently through stone, how it lingers, reshapes, deceives. A dying man could call for help in that chapel, and the echo might return from an entirely different direction. Perhaps the boy had cried out, perhaps no one had heard, because the building itself had changed the truth. In the vestry I examined the hymn books. One, placed slightly askew, bore the faint imprint of wet fingers. I turned the page and found an inscription in pencil, 3 letters joined by a line, as though someone had started a crossword and forgotten the clue. I copied it onto the margin of my notebook. It wasn't evidence, it was an invitation. The choirmaster came in then, startled to see me so still. He asked if I believed the boy had taken ill. I told him illness seldom arranges its victims with such care. When I left, the choir had gone, and the air tasted faintly of wax and rain. From the gate I looked back once. The windows glowed with that peculiar Oxford light, neither day nor night, but something between, as if the city itself refused to decide whether to remember or forget. I walked toward my car, the echo still within me, repeating the hymn in reverse. He played softly, as though the act of touching the piano itself might disturb some hidden pact. I had returned to the college the next afternoon, ostensibly to speak again with the choirmaster, though the truth was I wished to hear the instrument. Music, to my mind, is the most deceitful witness. It remembers everything and tells nothing. The room was long, high-ceilinged, the air faintly perfumed by varnish and dust. The pianist's shoulders rose and fell like a man half dreaming. When he stopped, there was a small silence, the kind that seems to draw breath rather than release it. He said he'd known the dead boy only slightly. Through rehearsals, through that communal silence between notes which musicians mistake for intimacy. He asked whether the police believed it was natural causes. I told him belief is a word best reserved for religion. Something in that answer seemed to please him. He smiled faintly, a weary private thing, and began to tidy his scores. I noticed a sheet tucked beneath the stand, marked not with music, but with small squares and letters. a crossword half done, though the handwriting was not his. The same neat line linking 3 letters, the same incomplete thought. He saw me glance, and in that quick motion of his hand, too swift, too careless, I realized he had seen it before, perhaps even placed it there himself. But guilt is never proof, only rhythm. I walked later through the quadrangle, my shoes echoing against the stones slick with rain. From the chapel came the thin voice of a rehearsal, unaccompanied, uncertain. Oxford has its own kind of grief it hides in the corners of sound, in the moments after applause fades, in the footsteps that follow too close. I thought of the tenor, of his clasped hands, of the way his face had seemed almost serene. Death can imitate devotion if it studies long enough. At the porter's lodge, a student nodded to me. He said the choirmaster had been unwell. Too much strain, he thought. The funeral arrangements, the police, the reporters. I said little. Inside, the kettle clicked once and fell silent, a small domestic punctuation to tragedy. There was a photograph on the notice board of the choir last Easter, frozen in sunlight. The boy stood slightly apart, as though he already knew he would not stay long. The pianist was there too, leaning at ease, his gaze not at the camera, but at the choirmaster beside him. It was the kind of glance people give when they have already said something unforgivable. Back in my flat that evening, I poured a measure of whiskey and watched the city's lamps shiver in the rain. The crossword page lay on my desk, folded carefully. I had traced the 3 letters in pencil, A, M, and K, initials perhaps, or the first bars of a ciphered phrase. I tried to think of words that might be fit'allegro, minor, key, a man of minor keys perhaps. The phrase lingered oddly like an unfinished melody. Somewhere in it was an answer that refused to speak its name. I telephoned Lewis then, told him to find out whether the pianist and the dead boy had ever shared a room outside rehearsal. He asked why, and I said, because sometimes the sound that lingers after music ends is not applause but regret. He said nothing for a moment, then promised he would ask around. When I hung up, the room felt heavier. The piano's last note still rang faintly in my head, though I had left the college hours before. It was the sort of sound that didn't fade, it adjusted itself to silence. Before turning in, I opened the window and let the rain settle on the sill. Oxford was half asleep, the bells of St. Michael's marking some late, forgotten hour. I thought of the pianist's hands, the calm precision of each movement, and of the boy's folded fingers, arranged so tenderly. Somewhere between them lay the truth soft, deliberate, and terribly quiet. They sang again that evening, as if repetition could erase what memory refused to release. I stood at the back of the chapel, the air faintly scented with lilies and the dull sweetness of old polish. The choirmaster raised his hands, and the first line rose a fragile harmony that seemed to question its own faith. I have never much cared for hymns, but this one lingered in the mind like something both beautiful and untrue. Perhaps that is why it always has a better melody. The pews were mostly empty, a scattering of students and staff pretending to pray. The pianist sat apart, his head bowed not in reverence but in calculation. Between verses I noticed how his fingers never quite stilled. They traced the edge of the bench, a metronome of nerves. I remembered the crossword on his desk, the faint graphite line connecting 3 lonely letters, and I wondered how many secrets begin with symmetry. After the rehearsal, the choirmaster found me near the vestry. He looked older than the day before, as if guilt itself had settled into the lines of his face. He said the college wished to keep the matter quiet. I said silence seldom keeps anything. He frowned, then smiled with the weary politeness of a man accustomed to avoiding questions. The boy had been talented, he murmured, but troubled. I asked, "What sort of trouble?" He hesitated just long enough to reveal the truth of the mission. "Nothing serious," he said finally. "Some small misunderstanding with another member of the choir. People always say small when they mean irreparable." In his office, I found the hymn sheets stacked with obsessive precision. Beneath the top layer was a single page of a different kind of letter, torn in half, the ink blurred at the edges by water. Or tears, if one wished to be sentimental. Only a few words survived, forgive me, and I could not bear minor keys. The phrase circled itself in my thoughts like a reluctant confession. Minor keys again. I began to wonder whether music had been the medium or the motive. Outside, dusk had fallen with its usual Oxford reluctance, the city neither night nor day, but a sort of philosophical indecision. I walked toward the cloisters, listening to my own footsteps. They echoed faintly as though something walked behind me, keeping pace. The sound grew softer when I reached the courtyard, then vanished altogether. It might have been the rain starting again. It might not. Lewis met me at the gate, his coat darkened by drizzle. He said the coroner's report mentioned traces of an unfamiliar sedative. Nothing dramatic, just enough to hush the pulse, quiet the breath. I asked if it could be self-administered. Possibly, he said, but the dosage was peculiar, precise to the point of artistry. That word stayed with me. Artistry. Death, like music, demands discipline. We walked a while without speaking. The chapel windows glowed faintly behind us, each pane trembling with the residual hum of the choir's final chord. I thought of the boys' folded hands, the pianist's restless ones, the choirmaster's deliberate stillness. In every pair of hands, some truth was being rehearsed. Lewis asked if I believed the pianist had reason to harm him. I said reason was never the issue. People do not kill for reasons. They kill for feelings they mistake for thoughts. At home, I placed the torn letter beside my whiskey glass. The watermarks aligned almost perfectly with the outline of musical notational slur, a rest, a pause that meant more than the note it followed. I tried to play the phrase on my old gramophone, matching the rhythm to the memory of the hymn. The result was off by a single beat. And in that hesitation, barely perceptible, but human, I felt the shape of what had gone wrong. Someone had miscounted somewhere. A missed entry, a breath taken too soon. When I turned out the light, the city was silent, but not at rest. I lay awake, thinking how easily harmony conceals dissonance, how sound fades, but its absence lingers. Oxford teaches you that lesson early, that the most dangerous noise is the one that isn't made. There are certain places in Oxford where silence feels cultivated, almost architectural, as if the air itself were trained to behave. St. Cyprian's was one of them, a small women's college folded neatly behind a row of chestnut trees, its lawns clipped into geometric submission. I had visited before, years earlier, for a lecture I scarcely remembered. But that afternoon, the quiet pressed differently. The students moved like echoes through the corridors, the sound of their steps softened by old rugs and older restraint. I had come to see Miss Hargreaves, the warden's woman, of formidable grammar and careful eyes. She welcomed me with the sort of politeness that carries a faint resistance beneath its courtesy. The incident, she said, had unsettled the choir badly. The boy's death had left the girls anxious, distracted. They were preparing for a recital next week, and grief, like dust, had a way of settling over everything. She spoke as though tragedy were an untidy guest she meant to show discreetly to the door. While she talked, I looked at her office. A row of hymnals, a small bust of Elgar, and on the desk a thin vase of tulips bending under their own perfume. Nothing remarkable, except the calendar still turned to the previous month. A small oversight, perhaps, but in a place so obsessed with order, even oversight is a form of confession. I asked whether any of her students had known the boy personally. She paused, adjusted the vase. A few had attended joint rehearsals, she said. One in particular, a soprano named Lydia French, gifted, though prone to melancholy. She said the last word carefully, as though it might stain the air. I requested to speak with the girl, and the warden's expression flickered with what might have been relief or warning. She sent it to her at once. Lydia arrived moments later, pale from the library's dimness. She spoke with that distant composure peculiar to the young feeling concealed beneath precision. She said the boy had once helped her with phrasing, that he was patient, almost shy. She remembered his habit of humming before a note, a quiet preparatory sound like a man reminding himself he existed. She hadn't seen him for several weeks, not since the end of term. Yet when she spoke his name, something in her voice trembled, as if the melody had altered, and she alone could hear it. I asked if he'd ever written to her. She shook her head too quickly, then smiled to soften it. When she rose to leave, a folded piece of paper slipped from her sleeve. I stopped to return it, and she murmured that it was nothing but a lyric translation, she said. But when I glanced at the page, I saw the same faint script I'd found before, the same linked letters drawn in pencil. She noticed my recognition and turned pale, like a singer caught between verses. I let her go. Sometimes silence yields more than questions. After she'd gone, Miss Hargreaves asked whether I had what I needed. I told her not yet. She said the police had already troubled the girls enough. I replied that the police often confuse inconvenience with completion. That earned me the smallest of smiles, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. There are women who wear restraint the way others wear jewelry, expensive, well-chosen, impossible to remove. As I walked back through the quadrangle, the late light caught on the chapel windows. Behind the glass I could just make out the faint motion of two figures, one seated, one standing, both still enough to seem carved. I could not hear them, but I imagined their conversation soft, deliberate, almost kind, the kind that ruins lives without intending to. That night, in my flat, I unfolded the scrap of paper I had kept from the boys' hymnal. The same letters stared back at me, A.M., no joined by one more, faintly smudged but distinct. L, I tried them in my mind as if across a crossword grid, letting the possibilities drift. A minor key, a man was killed, a melody kept. The meaning shifted each time, the pattern refusing to settle. I poured another whiskey and watched the liquid catch the lamplight like stained glass. Somewhere, a woman was still singing, and somewhere, someone was listening too closely. Music has a way of returning when it isn't wanted. That afternoon, the city was thick with drizzle, and the bells of St. Aldate's were practicing some intricate descent that refused to end. I had meant to walk, to think without sound, but Oxford does not permit silence. It fills every pause with echoes of its own refinement. I found myself instead in a small practice room at the edge of the college, drawn there by what I can only call curiosity, though it was really something quieter habit, perhaps. The piano stood open, a dull, black monument to discipline and regret. On the stand was a score marked in faint pencil, D minor adagio, unresolved. The pianist was not there, though his absence felt present enough. A single glass stood by the window, half filled with water gone still. I traced the margins of the sheet, small, deliberate markings, one of which caught my eye, a diagonal cross beside a single phrase, sempre dolente. Always sorrowful. I thought then of the boy, his folded hands, the way his death had seemed staged for reverence rather than despair. Someone had arranged not just his body, but the silence around it. Lewis found me there, his shoes leaving damp prints across the floor. He said the lab had matched the handwriting on the letter fragment to the choir master. Not proof, but suggestion. He asked what I thought of it. I said proof is a poor substitute for intuition. He sighed, saying intuition isn't admissible. I told him neither is conscience, and yet we both carry it. He shook his head and left me to my ghosts. After he'd gone, I noticed a small indentation in the dust on the piano lid's ring, perhaps, or the base of a candlestick. Not remarkable, except that the rest of the surface was immaculate. Whoever had used it last had been meticulous, and yet one careless trace remained. I rubbed at it lightly. The dust lifted, and beneath was the faint outline of letters, as though someone had written there long ago, and the polish had remembered. I could make out 2 words, forgive me, the same words that had survived the torn letter. Outside, the courtyard shimmered under the thin rain. I walked to the porter's lodge and asked whether the piano room had been booked the night before the boy was found. The porter flipped through the ledger with slow, bureaucratic grace. "One name," he said, "Miss Lydia French. But she hadn't played alone. The choirmaster had accompanied her. A rehearsal, he thought, though the hour was late. 9:30, perhaps later." I thanked him and stepped back into the mist. 9:30, the time when the city begins to empty, when truth feels briefly possible. At home, I poured a measure of whiskey and laid the fragments before the letter, the hymn sheet, and the copy of the score. The 3 letters, A-M-K, had ceased to feel random. I took out an old crossword, one I'd abandoned weeks earlier, and stared at the clue I'd never solved. 3 notes, one truth, all hidden in sorrow. The answer, of course, was key. The simplest answers always arrive last. The music in D minor was meant for a duet. I could hear it now, faintly, in memory, the 2 voices overlapping, reaching and retreating. Perhaps the boy had played that night, not the choirmaster. Perhaps Lydia had sung, and the wrong note had ended more than the song. But perhaps it is a useless word. It comforts only the unsolved. I closed the piano score and wrote a single line in my notebook. The sound that remains after harmony dies is the motive. It was not evidence, nor even deduction. Merely the whisper of something I hadn't yet understood. The whiskey had gone warm in my hand, and outside the rain gathered itself into something steadier. Somewhere in the college, a bell struck the hour, slow and deliberate. It might have been 9 again. It might always be 9 in Oxford, the hour when music ends and everything begins to sound like confession. It was one of those evenings Oxford invents to disguise its sin scandals, Latin grace, silver, heavy with reflection. The college feast at St. Cyprian's had been arranged before the scandal, but not cancelled after it. Tradition, after all, prefers continuity to conscience. I sat midway down the long table, flanked by a theologian who drank without blinking and a historian who blinked without speaking. The wine was indifferent but plentiful, and the conversation, like most at such events, hovered delicately above what mattered. The choirmaster was there, pale and composed, wearing the expression of a man who expects forgiveness to arrive by post. Lydia French sat 2 places to his right, in a dress the colour of ash. When their eyes met, which they did rarely, the air between them seemed to hesitate. I watched in the way one listens to a dissonant chordaware it must resolve, uncertain how. Across the hall, the pianist arrived late, murmured an apology to no one in particular, and began pouring wine as though he'd earned it. Lewis had joined me only because I insisted. He disliked formal dinners and said so under his breath when the Latin began. He asked if I believed the murderer would attend his own requiem. I told him most do if the wine is good enough. He said I was becoming morbid. I said I'd always been. During the second course, conversation drifted to the boy's funeral, how touching the music had been, how unfortunate the weather. I asked quietly who had chosen the final hymn. The choirmaster's fork paused mid-air. He said the choir had decided collectively. Lydia corrected him softly. No, she said, it was your suggestion. His reply was careful. I only thought it was fitting. The table moved on, but I saw the tremor that ran through her hand as she lifted her glass. Wine has a way of revealing the unsteady. After dessert, the warden proposed a toast to endurance, though it sounded more like surrender. I slipped away before the speeches ended, claiming a headache. Outside the night was damp and faintly luminous, the cobbles shining as if freshly varnished. Through the chapel window I could see the faint shimmer of candles, their flames leaning toward the draught. The pianist was there again, alone this time, his hands resting idly on the keys. He was playing something in D minor, slow and unfinished. I stood by the window and listened. The tune faltered once, then recovered, and in that tiny imperfection I recognized the melody from the torn hymn sheet, a phrase of regret masquerading as devotion. I entered quietly. He didn't turn. I said I hadn't realized he was religious. He smiled faintly and said, "Music is the only prayer that's ever answered." I asked whether the hymn had been his composition. He hesitated too long. "The boy liked it," he said at last, said it sounded like a secret. Then, as if remembering himself, he added that the choirmaster had made some small adjustments to the harmonies. "For depth," he said, "for depth." I could almost hear the word sink. When I left, the feast had broken into laughter somewhere behind me, the kind that comes too late in the evening to be genuine. I walked past the porter's lodge, where a forgotten light still burned. On the counter lay the attendance register for the dinner. A neat column of names, all crossed through except one Lydia's. She had left early or not arrived at all. Yet I had seen her at the table. I stared at the list again. The signature beneath hers, written in the same careful hand, was the choirmaster's. And between them, faintly smudged as though erased and rewritten, was the pianist's. The three signatures formed a pattern, not horizontal but diagonal, an arrangement of letters that looked almost deliberate. Back in my flat, I tried to sketch it out on a scrap of paper. 3 names, 3 letters, 3 notes. A minor key again, always minor. I poured a whiskey and let the pattern rest against the rim of my thoughts. Outside, the city had gone quiet, but the faint hum of the chapel organ lingered in my ears. The melody refused to resolve. Oxford, as always, preferred its songs unfinished. It was the sort of afternoon that could only belong to Oxford, muted, spectral, suspended between drizzle and thought. The college library stood empty, its lamps burning like small acts of defiance against the gathering dark. I'd come under the pretext of returning a borrowed volume, but truthfully I had no appetite for home. Silence is easier among the dead than among the living, and books make better witnesses. The librarian, a stooped man with eyes that seemed to catalogue more than shelve, nodded me toward the upper gallery. He said the warden had requested certain materials be locked away after the tragedy. He did not specify which tragedy in Oxford, the plural is understood. The gallery smelled of paper and polish. At the far end, a box lay half open, filled with the remnants of forgotten exhibition programs, concert notices, photographs curling at the edges. I sifted through them absently until one image stopped me. A black and white photograph of the choir taken 2 years earlier. The boy was there, standing near the center, his expression caught between youth and awareness. On either side of him stood Lydia and the pianist. The choirmaster was slightly behind, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder, not possessive, not tender, but something in between. The image had been developed with care, the shadows balanced just enough to flatter. Yet the boy's eyes seemed to know too much for the moment to be innocent. I studied the background. Behind them, on the chapel wall, hung a framed inscription in Latin. Most would have ignored it, but I recognized the phrase "Cantate Domino" in tono minor, sing to the Lord in a minor key. A wry joke, perhaps, or a warning disguised as piety. The same phrase had appeared almost invisibly in the margin of the score found beside the piano. I remembered it then, faint but deliberate, as if someone had meant to be discovered only by those listening in the right pitch. Lewis arrived an hour later, shaking the rain from his coat. He said the pianist had vanished, his rooms cleared, his bank account untouched. I told him vanishing requires less courage than staying. He said the choirmaster had offered to assist further with the investigation. I asked whether he'd volunteered or insisted. Lewis smiled grimly. "Insisted," he said. "That told me enough." We sat beneath the window, the rain threading its way down the glass. I showed him the photograph. He said it proved nothing. I agreed, but I pointed to the boy's hand, barely visible against his robes. His fingers were curled, not relaxed, as if gripping something unseen, a gesture easy to overlook unless one had spent years watching people lie. Lewis frowned, then shrugged. I could tell he thought me fanciful. Perhaps I was, but intuition, like music, depends on phrasing. When he left, I lingered a while longer. The library clock struck 6, the sound hollow and ecclesiastical. I returned the photograph to its box, but slipped one copy into my coat. Theft, perhaps, but of the mildest kind. I walked out through the quadrangle, the damp air thick with the smell of rain and chalk. The chapel bell began its rehearsal for evening prayer, the notes falling one by one into the puddles. Later at home, I laid the photograph under the lamplight. The boy's eyes still followed mine, as though he'd been waiting all this time to be asked the right question. Behind him, the inscription shimmered faintly, minor key, always minor. I thought of Lydia's trembling hand at the feast, the choirmaster's paused fork, the pianist's vanishing act, and how every truth in Oxford seemed to choose its own key signature, some played loudly, some barely audible, all ultimately unresolved. I poured the last of the whiskey and placed the photograph on the windowsill. Outside, the city's lights swam in the mist, blurred and watchful. Somewhere, unseen, a bell tolled again too late, too soft, too perfectly in tune. I thought then of the boy's final hymn and the phrase he must have sung, the one that no one had truly heard. It ended not with a note, but with breath, the quietest confession in D minor. There are moments when music deceives you, not through error, but through perfection. A harmony too flawless begins to sound unnatural, as though the human heart has been edited out. That thought came to me the next evening, standing in the chapel once again, where the choir rehearsed for the memorial service. Their voices floated upward, pure and mechanical, like light refracted through glass. It was beautiful in the way cold water is beautiful, clear, merciless, indifferent. The choirmaster stood at the front, precise and immaculate, his hand carving invisible shapes in the air. Lydia was there too, her face composed into stillness, though her eyes betrayed fatigue. The pianist had not returned, and no one mentioned his absence. Oxford is skilled at collective amnesia. I took a seat at the back, pretending to listen, though my mind was elsewhere, on a photograph folded in my pocket, on a missing man, on 3 letters that refused to align. During the final verse, the soprano section faltered. A dissonant note slipped through, barely perceptible, quickly corrected. Yet in that instant the choirmaster's expression changed, a flicker of irritation that seemed to carry something heavier, almost grief. I watched him end the piece with a curt gesture, then linger over the silence that followed. When he turned toward me, his face had resumed its composure, but I had already seen what I needed to see. False harmony is always betrayed by what happens just after the last note. After the rehearsal, he invited me to his room for a drink. I accepted. He poured brandy with the calm of a man accustomed to ceremony. The room was severe, no photographs, no clutter, no softness. He asked if I believed in forgiveness. I told him I preferred understanding. He smiled faintly and said understanding is only the polite word for control. I asked whether he felt in control now. His silence was longer than any confession could have been. On the mantel stood a metronome, its pendulum arrested mid-swing. Dust gathered unevenly along the base, except for a clean oval where something had recently rested. A photograph, perhaps, or a glass, or both. I let the observation pass in silence. He spoke again about the boy, about his voice, about how talent often attracts cruelty. I asked what kind of cruelty he meant. He said the kind that hides in admiration. The brandy trembled slightly in his glass. I began to think that guilt, like music, requires rhythm to survive. It needs to repeat itself to be believed. When I left, the corridor outside was empty. A faint hum reached me from the chapel, a single note sustained too long to be accidental. I followed it, expecting to find one of the girls tidying the hymnals. But the pews were empty. The sound came from the organ itself, a low drone, the wind still trapped in its pipes. I pressed a key, and the note ceased. On the bench lay a folded score, open to the same D minor piece. Someone had written a line across the margin, if only silence could forgive. The handwriting matched the torn letter. I took it, not as evidence, but as echo. Outside, rain had begun again, soft as dust. Lewis was waiting by the gate, his umbrella tilted against the wind. He said the pianist had been found alive, but barely at a guest house in Jericho. Overdose, but deliberate, he thought. I told him not to use that word. He asked what word I'd prefer. I said escape. He looked at me sharply, but said nothing. We walked together toward the car, our steps falling into an unsteady rhythm. Back at my flat, I placed the score beside the photograph on my desk. The boy's gaze in the image seemed changed now, no longer questioning, but knowing. Beneath the lamplight, the penciled letters formed a diagonal pattern that could be read in two directions, depending on how one held the page. One way spelled guilt, the other grace. I wasn't sure which belonged to whom. The whiskey was nearly gone. I poured the last of it and listened to the night outside, the rain against the window, the faint chiming from the college tower. Every sound carried its own kind of confession. Oxford, in the dark, always hums in a minor key, as though afraid of resolution. I suppose I am no different. I have learned that every harmony hides a silence waiting to be heard. There are certain hours in Oxford when the city seems to withdraw from itself, leaving only the sound of its own history breathing. That night, walking along the cobbles of St. Cyprian's Lane, I felt it closing in again, the hush that falls when a secret begins to recognize its listener. The memorial service had been postponed, officially out of respect for the pianist's condition, unofficially because the music had become too dangerous to play. I found myself outside the chapel once more. The doors were unlocked, a poor precaution, or perhaps a quiet invitation. Inside, the air held the faint sweetness of extinguished candles mixed with the metallic tang of rain on stone. On the lectern lay the hymnal, still open to the boy's final piece. only now there was something missing. A verse had been cut neatly from the page, the tear deliberate, almost surgical. Someone had taken it, and with it the words that had carried their private meaning. Lewis joined me a little after midnight. He looked older in the half-light, his coat glistening with rain. He said the pianist had regained consciousness, muttered something coherent about the choirmaster, and a verse that was never meant to be sung. Then silence again, the kind that closes around guilt like a fist. I told him about the missing page. He frowned and said perhaps it had been sentimental theft. I said, nothing. Oxford breeds thefts of sentiment. They are its currency. I walked the length of the choir stalls. Dust motes drifted lazily through the lamplight, and on the floor I noticed a scrap of thin paper, almost translucent with damp. The ink had bled but not disappeared. I could make out fragments and forgive minor voices within the voice, a lyric or a confession. I slipped it into my pocket, feeling its fragility against my skin. Lewis asked what I'd found. I told him, truthfully enough, that it wasn't finished yet. We left together, but I turned back at the gate. Through the stained glass, the chapel glowed faintly as though illuminated from within by something that refused to die. It reminded me of the crossword I'd half solved the night before. The clue had been simple. Something missing that still remains. The answer, I'd realized now, was echo. The next morning, the choirmaster requested to see me. His rooms were immaculate, as always. He said the investigation was a distraction that art, like faith, cannot survive scrutiny. I asked whether that was why he had altered the hymn. He didn't answer. His gaze wandered to the window, where the grey light flattened everything into the same pallid shade. I told him the missing verse would be found sooner or later. He smiled then, and for the first time I saw the fatigue beneath the polish. Perhaps, he said softly, it was never lost. Only misplaced in the wrong voice. When I left him, I went to the college archives. The librarian, a severe man with the patience of stone, produced the original score. It had been composed years earlier by a student who died before graduation. The final verse, noted in the margins, had been crossed out in red ink. Beside it, a line, "Silence completes the prayer." I copied it down. The handwriting was unmistakable, the choirmaster's. He had edited the piece long before the boy ever sang it. Long before there was any death to explain. By evening, I sat in my flat, the city's bells tolling faintly through the rain. The scrap of paper lay beside my glass. The words had blurred further, dissolving into soft suggestions. Voice within the voice. I thought of the boy again, his expression in the photograph neither frightened nor resigned, but aware, as if he understood that his song would outlast him. Music, after all, is only the echo of what's been taken away. I turned off the lamp and listened to the rain against the window, each drop falling like a beat withheld. Somewhere beyond the edge of hearing, the organ of St. Cyprian's might have stirred, or perhaps it was only memory. I've never been sure since. Some truths, like lost verses, are better left unrescued. They sing louder that way. There are endings that pretend to be conclusions and others that merely disguise continuations. Oxford, with its fondness for ceremony, prefers the former. The memorial was held 2 days later, under a sky the colour of pewter. The chapel was full, though few seemed to listen. People attend such events not to remember, but to be seen remembering. Lydia sang a single verse from the hymn that had haunted the case from the start. Her voice, soft and tremulous, carried through the nave like a thread unwilling to break. When it ended, the silence that followed was unbearable, not for its reverence, but for what it failed to conceal. The choirmaster sat motionless in the front pew. I watched him as one might watch a man drowning slowly in plain sight. The pianist was absent, confined still to his hospital bed, his fate uncertain. Lewis stood beside me, restless, whispering something about closure. I told him that music, like guilt, rarely resolves cleanly. He frowned, not quite following, and I didn't explain. Explanation is mercy, and I've never been generous with it. After the service I lingered, the chapel emptied, the scent of lilies mingling with candle smoke. On the lectern lay a new hymnal, freshly printed. I opened it and turned to the last page. The final hymn bore the same title, but the missing verse had been copied, restored, and no longer absent. Beneath it, in the smallest print, an attribution arrangement by AMK, the initials again, always the same sequence, repeating like a refrain. AMK, 3 notes, 3 lives, 1 ruinous harmony. Outside, the rain began. Lewis waited by the car, but I walked instead through the cloister, letting the drops find me. The courtyard glistened, and somewhere nearby a piano began to play. Not from the chapel, but from one of the upper rooms overlooking the quad. The melody was unmistakable D minor, slow, unfinished. I followed the sound until I reached the door. It was ajar, and through it I could see Lydia, seated at the instrument, her hands trembling above the keys. She stopped when she saw me, though the final note hung between us, undecided. I asked her when she had learned the piece. She said she hadn't, that it came to her in dreams, the way grief sometimes does. I asked if she knew what the initials meant. Her answer was almost kind. "Perhaps they mean nothing," she said. "Perhaps they are only the remains of a chord no one wanted to hear." Then she closed the lid of the piano with a sound that felt like punctuation. I thanked her and left, though I knew gratitude had no place there. That evening, back in my flat, I found the old photograph again. The choir, the boy, the inscription on the wall, "Sing to the Lord" in a minor key. Beneath the image, faintly etched into the frame, were the same initials. I ran my thumb across them and thought of the choirmaster's words, understanding as control, silence as prayer. The logic of it unfolded slowly like a musical theme returning after a long absence. The boy, the pianist, the choirmaster, each trapped in the same arrangement, each note leaning toward dissonance. Lydia's verse was merely the echo that remained. Later, Lewis telephoned. The choirmaster had confessed, though not in the way men usually do. A note left on his desk addressed to no one. The words were brief: "Forgive the false harmony." They found him not long after in the chapel. The organ was still playing when they arrived, an empty bench. A final refrain repeated itself until the air ran out. I didn't attend the second service. Instead, I sat by the window with a whiskey and the faint sound of the city's bells drifting through the rain. I thought about the boy's voice, about how something so fragile could undo so much. And I thought about how music, once set loose in the world, can never be recalled. It continues in secret, like remorse. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it a single, wavering note from the chapel across the square. It was D minor again, always D minor. I closed my eyes and listened, until even that faded into something quieter than sound. There, in that vanishing, I understood what the lost verse had meant all along. Silence completes the prayer,